294 South Korean Marines sat dug into a hilltop near the village of Tra Binh Dong on the night of February 14, 1967. They had barbed wire, claymore mines, and trenches connecting every fighting position in a heart-shaped perimeter roughly 300 by 200 meters across. Their commanding officer, Captain Young Kyung-jin, a graduate of the Korean Naval Academy, had spent the previous days reinforcing every inch of that position because intelligence from a Viet Cong defector told him something was coming, something big. At approximately 23:20 hours, a Marine in the observation post detected movement to the west and reported back to the 3rd Platoon. What was approaching through the dark jungle was not a probing attack, not a harassment team, not a squad of guerrillas testing the perimeter. It was a reinforced regiment. Over 2,400 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters from the 40th and 60th Battalions, supported by a local force battalion from Quang Ngai, were closing in from every direction. Their plan was straightforward: breach the wire, overrun the hilltop, annihilate the Korean company in a single hour, then advance on the Chu Lai Air Base and the city of Quang Ngai before dawn. The assault detonated with mortar fire and automatic weapons from every angle. Fog rolled in and grounded the AC-47 gunships the Koreans had requested. They were on their own. And what happened over the next 4 hours did not just shock the North Vietnamese commanders who ordered the attack. It sent a message through every communist unit operating in South Vietnam. A message carried not in intelligence briefings or radio intercepts, but in the broken bodies of 246 dead fighters left scattered across a hilltop, that 294 Koreans refused to surrender. Oh, this story gets so much wilder than you think, because what those Korean Marines were doing in Vietnam, the way they fought, the way they trained, the things that made them different from every other Allied force on the ground, produced results so devastating and so psychologically shattering that captured Viet Cong orders from 1966 carried a specific instruction about South Korean forces, an instruction written in language that went beyond tactical caution. It read like dread. Contact with the Koreans is to be avoided at all costs, unless a Viet Cong victory is 100% certain. You are about to discover why the second largest foreign force in Vietnam, a force from a nation that was itself still recovering from a devastating war barely a decade earlier, fought with an intensity that made American allies uncomfortable and communist enemies terrified. And trust me, by the end of this, you will understand why the Viet Cong stopped treating them as ordinary soldiers and started treating them as something else entirely. Something they had a specific name for: Guishin Jabnun Hebyongdae, the ghost-catching Marines. Stay with me. To understand why South Korean Marines fought the way they did in Vietnam, you cannot start in the jungles of Quang Ngai or the rice paddies of Pu Yen. You have to start on the frozen ridgelines of Korea itself, barely 15 years earlier, where many of the officers and senior sergeants who would lead troops in Vietnam first learned what it meant to fight communists, not as an abstract ideological exercise, as a matter of personal survival and national existence. The Korean War had ended in 1953, but it had not ended cleanly, and it had not ended peacefully. An armistice held the peninsula in a state of suspended hostility, with North Korean forces massed along the demilitarized zone, and the memory of invasion, occupation, and mass death embedded in every institution of the South Korean state. The men who built the Republic of Korea's military in the years after that war carried specific memories. They remembered the surprise assault of June 1950 that nearly pushed them into the sea. They remembered the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter. They remembered Chinese human wave attacks at the Chosin Reservoir. They remembered what it felt like to watch their country nearly disappear. This was not historical knowledge absorbed through textbooks. This was lived trauma, carried in the bodies and minds of men who were still serving, still commanding, still shaping military doctrine when Vietnam began demanding volunteers. The Capital Division, which would earn the nickname Fierce Tiger in Vietnam, had fought through the entire Korean War, surviving the initial North Korean onslaught, holding the Pusan perimeter, and advancing during MacArthur's counteroffensive. The 9th Infantry Division had earned the name White Horse after defending Hill 395 near Kior Wan in October 1952, where its 3 regiments held against repeated Chinese assaults in some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. The 2nd Marine Brigade, which would become the Blue Dragons, carried the Korean Marine Corps legacy from the Korean War, where the Marines had earned their own fearsome nickname, Gwishin Jaebenen Haebyongdae, the ghost-catching Marines, for their effectiveness against communist guerrillas on Jeju Island and during amphibious operations at Incheon. These were not peacetime formations being sent to a foreign conflict. These were combat-tested units whose institutional identity was built on fighting communism at close quarters, and whose officers and senior non-commissioned officers had personal experience with what happened when you lost. When President Park Chung-hee authorized the deployment of combat troops to Vietnam in 1965, his motivations were layered and calculating. Publicly, he framed it as repaying a debt to the free world allies who had fought to save South Korea during the Korean War. Privately, the calculus was more complex. Park saw Vietnam as an opportunity to strengthen the alliance with the United States at a moment when American commitment to Korean defense seemed uncertain. He saw it as a chance to demonstrate that South Korea had come of age militarily, that it was no longer a dependent client state requiring American supervision, and he saw it as an economic opportunity. Korean soldiers in Vietnam would be paid by the United States government, and those dollars would flow back to Seoul, funding the industrial development that would eventually transform South Korea from one of the poorest nations on earth into an economic powerhouse. But Park insisted on conditions. The troops would be volunteers, hand-picked from the best units in the Korean military. They would answer to their own officers. Korean commanders would retain tactical control over their own forces, and the units selected would be the ones with the longest service records and the finest combat heritage from the Korean War. Park personally selected senior officers. He wanted Vietnam to showcase Korean military capability, not subordinate it. The deployment began in the autumn of 1965. The Capital Division, the Tigers, arrived first, followed closely by the 2nd Marine Brigade, the Blue Dragons. By the end of the year, over 18,000 South Korean troops were in country. In 1966, the 9th Infantry Division, the White Horse, followed, bringing total Korean strength to nearly 48,000. Over the course of the entire war, approximately 320,000 South Koreans would rotate through Vietnam, making them the largest non-American foreign force in the conflict by a significant margin. They arrived with World War II-era weapons, M1 Garand rifles, and M1 carbines, while the Viet Cong they faced often carried AK-47s with superior automatic firepower. They arrived with limited helicopter assets, limited air support, and a fraction of the logistical infrastructure available to American forces. They relied on overwhelming use of heavy artillery to compensate for the disadvantage in individual small arms and on American air assets assigned through liaison arrangements that gave Korean units the same priority as American formations. But logistics and firepower ratios told only part of the story. What they brought that could not be measured in equipment tables or supply manifests was something else entirely. They brought an intensity forged in their own war, a hatred of communism that was personal rather than political, and a physical toughness that American observers found simultaneously impressive and unsettling. The Korean contingent also brought something that American forces lacked entirely: a corps commander structure that unified all three Korean formations under a single Korean general. On the recommendation of General William Westmoreland, Lieutenant General Chae Myung-shin, the commander of the Capital Division, formed a Korean Corps headquarters in Nha Trang. This gave the Koreans a unified command that could coordinate operations across their entire coastal area of responsibility without routing decisions through American channels. It was an arrangement that reflected both American respect for Korean military capability and Korean insistence on operational independence. Every 6 months, General Chai would sit down with the American commander of the 1st Field Force and the South Vietnamese commander of the 2nd Corps to plan the next 6 months of coordinated operations. There was never conflict over areas of responsibility. Only the timing and allocation of support assets required negotiation. Within their own sector, the Koreans planned and executed operations as they saw fit. Every South Korean soldier in Vietnam trained daily in Taekwondo. This was not ceremonial exercise. 30 minutes each morning, every morning, full contact practice that conditioned bodies for close quarters violence. The Korean martial art had been formalized in the 1950s and was already embedded in military culture as a combat discipline, not a sport. Korean soldiers did not merely know how to fight with their hands and feet. They had spent years practicing strikes designed to break bones, collapse ribs, and kill at close range. In the tunnels and bunkers of Vietnam, where rifles became unwieldy and grenades were as dangerous to the thrower as the target, this capability proved devastatingly practical. American soldiers who witnessed Korean close-quarters engagements described scenes that seemed to belong to a different century of warfare. One American reconnaissance soldier, recounting an engagement in southern Binh Dinh province, described arriving at the aftermath of a Korean firefight and finding Viet Cong fighters with broken necks, caved-in ribs, and crushed skulls. The Koreans had fought through a position using bayonets, entrenching tools, and their bare hands, with an efficiency that left American observers struggling for adequate description. The Blue Dragon Brigade moved initially to Cam Ranh Bay in September 1965, then relocated to Tuy Hoa in Phu Yen Province to provide security against the North Vietnamese 95th Regiment. The 95th had been pressing against the local population for weeks, threatening both the government administration and the critical rice harvest that sustained the region. The Blue Dragons worked alongside the 1st Brigade of the American 101st Airborne Division in Operation Van Buren, a month-long campaign to clear Tuy Hoa of communist infiltrators. Over 33 days of continuous operations, 54 Americans and 45 South Koreans were killed, while 679 communist fighters were eliminated. Together, they secured the harvest of 30,000 metric tons of rice, denying a critical food supply to the enemy. At the conclusion of the operation, The American paratroopers left. The South Koreans stayed and took sole responsibility for the area. That pattern would repeat throughout the war. Americans would conduct operations and depart. Koreans would conduct operations and remain. The difference in effect was profound. In August 1966, the Blue Dragons shifted north to Chu Lai, placed under the operational coordination of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force. Under an arrangement with the United States Marine Corps, American air assets would support the Korean Brigade with the same priority given to American units. 2-man fire control teams from the 1st Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company were assigned to each Korean Marine Infantry Company at all times, providing the critical link between Korean ground forces and American air power. The Tiger Division established itself around Quy Nhon in Binh Dinh Province, with responsibility for securing Highways 1 and 19, the vital arteries connecting the coast to the Central Highlands. The White Horse Division took up positions in the Ninh Hoa area, controlling the stretch of Highway 1 from Tuy Hoi south to Phan Rang. Together, the 3 Korean formations held a vast stretch of the central Vietnamese coast, an area crawling with Viet Cong infrastructure and North Vietnamese regular forces. What distinguished Korean operations from American operations began at the most basic level: how they cleared an area. American units typically conducted a single sweep through a village or hamlet, removed civilians for screening, and moved on. Korean forces operated differently. They surrounded an area by stealth and rapid movement, then searched it with a thoroughness that American commanders found remarkable. They swept through every structure, every bunker, every tunnel entrance, every cache site. When they finished, they went back and searched again. This methodical approach paid immediate dividends. Korean units consistently recovered more weapons per operation than comparable American formations conducting similar missions. The weapon seizure statistics became one of the clearest indicators that the Koreans were finding things Americans were missing. They also developed intelligence capabilities that surprised their allies. Korean soldiers learned Pidgin Vietnamese quickly, in part because they deliberately avoided relying on Vietnamese translators, whom they suspected of being compromised by Viet Cong intelligence. As fellow Asians, they could move through villages with a cultural familiarity that tall, conspicuous American soldiers could not replicate. They shared Buddhist religious practices with many Vietnamese. They ate rice as a staple. They could read social dynamics in village interactions with an intuition born of cultural proximity rather than foreign observation. But it was in combat that the Koreans made their most lasting impression, and no engagement demonstrated their character more completely than what happened at Tra Binh Dong. When the North Vietnamese regiment breached the wire on the western side of the Korean perimeter in the early hours of February 15, 1967, the fighting immediately became the kind of close-quarters nightmare that most military doctrines are designed to avoid. The enemy poured through the gap in the 3rd Platoon sector, using flamethrowers and Bangalore torpedoes against Korean bunkers. Mortar fire rained onto the Hai hilltop. Both platoon leaders in the initial engagement zone were wounded. The company command post took a direct hit, wounding Captain Chung. What happened next would have been the beginning of collapse in many military forces. In the Korean Marines, it was the beginning of something else entirely. 2nd Lieutenant Shin Won-bai, commanding the 1st Platoon, did not wait for orders from a wounded commander in a damaged command post. He assembled a fire team and led them 100 meters beyond the perimeter, directly into the attacking force, to locate and destroy the enemy mortar section that was tearing apart the hilltop. Firing machine guns and throwing grenades, Shin and Staff Sergeant Oh Sung Hwan killed the North Vietnamese mortar crews, then rallied survivors and counterattacked to restore the perimeter breach. Inside the perimeter, Korean Marines who had expended their rifle ammunition fixed bayonets. When bayonets were not enough, they fought with entrenching tools. When entrenching, tools broke. They used pickaxes. When pickaxes were lost, they fought with rocks and fists. One wounded Marine, surrounded and unable to retreat, refused capture by pulling the pins on 2 grenades as enemy soldiers entered his bunker. He died on his own terms and took his attackers with him. Captain Jung, despite his wounds, recognized that the conventional defensive approach was failing against the sheer weight of enemy numbers. He made a decision that defied every instinct of a commander watching his perimeter collapse. He ordered his Marines to pull back from the breached sections, deliberately allowing several hundred Viet Cong fighters to pour into the base. Then he sent 2 squads to seal the gap behind them. The enemy was inside the perimeter. They were also trapped. Jung ordered the remaining Marines to fix bayonets and counterattack into the trapped enemy force. What followed was close-quarters carnage. Korean Marines swept through their own positions, killing enemy fighters, at arm's length, clearing bunker by bunker, trench by trench. Over 100 of the 246 confirmed enemy dead were killed inside the Korean perimeter, most of them in hand-to-hand fighting. By 0730, the Marines had cleared their base and driven the survivors back into the jungle. American Marine A-4 Skyhawks arrived to hammer the retreating force. When the dust settled, 246 enemy fighters lay dead against 15 Korean Marines killed. The North Vietnamese had also left behind 3 flamethrowers, 5 anti-tank rocket launchers, 2 machine guns, 29 rifles, 100 pieces of dynamite, and over 6,000 rounds of ammunition. The aftermath of Tra Binh Dong rippled outward in every direction. The commanding generals of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force and the 2nd Korean Marine Brigade flew to the hilltop the morning after the battle. They were followed by the commanders of the 1st Corps and Military Assistance Command Vietnam. South Korean President Park Chung-hee, upon receiving the battle report, directed that every enlisted Marine in the 11th Company be promoted 1 rank, the first unit-wide promotion since the Korean War. He dispatched his Prime Minister, Defense Minister, and Marine Commandant to Vietnam to conduct the promotions personally. The Defense Minister who made the trip was Kim Sung-eun, the most storied Marine commander of the Korean War and a former Marine Commandant himself. Captain Jung and 2nd Lieutenant Shin each received the Taeguk Medal, South Korea's equivalent of the Medal of Honor. During the entire Vietnam War, the Taeguk Medal was awarded only 11 times. Tra Binh Dong was the only battle where it was given to 2 individuals. The New York Times reported the engagement as the South Koreans' greatest victory in their 15 months in Vietnam. Foreign journalists picked up the story, and a phrase entered the Korean military lexicon that would stick permanently: the legend makers. It joined the older Korean War legacy of the ghost-catching Marines and the invincible Marines. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces operating in the area, the message was simpler and more immediate. They abandoned plans for subsequent attacks against the Chu Lai Air Base and the city of Quang Ngai. The Korean hilltop that should have been a stepping stone for a major offensive became the graveyard where the offensive died. But Tra Binh Dong was not an isolated event. It was the most dramatic expression of a pattern that repeated itself across every Korean area of operations in Vietnam. The Tiger Division's first year in country was a methodical dismantling of Viet Cong infrastructure in Binh Dinh province. Operating from their base west of Quy Nhon, the Tigers opened Highway 19, secured Highway 1, and pushed government control into areas that had not seen it in years. In their first year of operations, they killed over 3,000 Viet Cong and captured nearly 600 against 290 Korean dead. In conjunction with the American 1st Cavalry Division and South Vietnamese forces, they gradually drove North Vietnamese regular forces from Phu Cat Mountain and secured the surrounding lowlands. The White Horse Division proved equally effective from its positions along the central coast. During Operation O Jac Q in 1967, the division conducted a surprise attack against the North Vietnamese 95th Regiment in Phu Yen Province, spoiling a planned communist offensive before it could launch. During Operation Bac Ma 9 in October 1968, the division claimed 382 North Vietnamese killed, rendering the enemy's 7th Battalion, 18th Regiment, combat ineffective. On one day during that operation, the 25th of October, the division's anniversary, Korean forces claimed 204 enemy dead without losing a single soldier. The combined effect of Korean operations produced measurable results across their tactical areas of responsibility. Viet Cong initiated incidents declined steadily. Road security improved. Villages that had been under communist control for years became contested, then shifted toward government influence. American commanders who evaluated the Korean sector consistently assessed it as among the safest Allied areas of operations in Vietnam. The Korean approach to area security differed fundamentally from American methods in its permanence and its integration with civilian life. Korean soldiers attended Buddhist religious services in Vietnamese villages. They ran medical clinics, treating thousands of civilians. They repaired homes damaged by combat operations. They built schools and bridges. This was not altruism disconnected from military purpose. It was counterinsurgency doctrine shaped by the Korean experience in their own country, where government legitimacy among rural populations was understood as a military objective, not a humanitarian afterthought. The Koreans believed, with some justification, that they understood Asian peasant populations better than Americans could. They shared dietary customs, religious traditions, and agricultural rhythms that made interaction feel natural rather than forced. The statistical evidence was striking. The Koreans achieved kill ratios consistently above 10-1, and during certain operations, ratios of 24-1 or higher. General William Westmoreland praised them publicly, telling a joint session of the United States Congress in 1967 that the Koreans ranked among the best fighters in Vietnam. He described the Blue Dragon Brigade specifically as a troubleshooting outfit. American studies noted that Korean forces seized more weapons than American units in comparable operations, a critical metric because weapons capture indicated genuine damage to enemy capability rather than mere body count inflation. The Korean approach to counterinsurgency contained elements that their allies found both effective and disquieting. Korean discipline was severe by any standard. Soldiers who committed offenses faced punishments that American military justice would not have permitted. In at least one documented instance, 2 Korean soldiers who assaulted a Vietnamese woman were executed before their own company. The message to every Korean soldier in that formation was unmistakable. Discipline was not a guideline, it was absolute. But Korean operations also carried a darkness that cannot be separated from the story of their effectiveness. The same ferocity that made them devastating against armed enemy forces was, at times, directed against civilians. Reports of Korean brutality against Vietnamese villagers emerged throughout the war, initially suppressed by both Korean military censorship and American reluctance to publicize the conduct of a valued ally. American Marine General Rath von Tompkins stated that when Korean Marines received fire from a village, they would divert from their route and level the entire settlement as a lesson. General Robert Cushman later acknowledged significant problems with Korean conduct toward civilians. Korean government documents would eventually suggest that as many as 8,000 Vietnamese civilians were killed by Korean forces between 1965 and 1973. The most thoroughly documented incident occurred at Phong Ni in Quang Nam Province on February 12, 1968, when approximately 100 troops from the 2nd Marine Brigade entered the village and killed 70 women, children, and elderly. Survivors included an 8-year-old girl named Nguyen Thi Thanh, who was shot in the stomach. The rest of her family perished. Decades later, in 2023, a South Korean district court ordered the Korean government to pay compensatory damages to Nguyen in a landmark ruling. The Korean government appealed. These events represented the catastrophic failure mode of the Korean approach. The intensity that made them formidable against armed combatants became indiscriminate when applied to environments where the line between civilian and combatant was deliberately blurred by an enemy that lived among the population. Korean commanders, operating under directives from President Park to minimize Korean casualties above all other considerations, created conditions where collective punishment of villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong became, in some units, standard practice rather than aberration. This is the complexity that any honest accounting of Korean forces in Vietnam must confront. The same units that fought with extraordinary courage at Tra Binh Dong, that secured roads and rice harvests, and established government presence in areas abandoned for years, also committed acts against civilians that constitute war crimes by any reasonable legal standard. The Korean veterans who served in Vietnam carried both of these realities home with them, and South Korean society would spend decades avoiding a reckoning with the full truth. What cannot be disputed, because the enemy's own documents confirmed it, was the tactical impact Korean forces achieved. Captured Viet Cong orders from 1966, reported by Time magazine, explicitly instructed communist units to avoid contact with Korean forces unless victory was absolutely certain. Documents seized after the Tet Offensive reinforced this directive, warning Viet Cong fighters to never engage the South Koreans until full victory was assured. Enemy intelligence assessments noted that it was the Viet Cong who were more often ambushed by Korean forces, not the reverse, an inversion of the typical pattern that plagued American operations. The Koreans had achieved something that American forces, with all their advantages in firepower, mobility, and technology, struggled to replicate. They had made the enemy afraid to operate in Korean-controlled territory, not afraid of airstrikes, which could be waited out, not afraid of sweeps, which ended when the helicopters departed, afraid of a persistent, methodical, unrelenting presence that never seemed to leave, that found weapons caches other forces missed, that fought with a savagery at close quarters that communist veterans of years of jungle warfare found genuinely shocking. The foundation of this effectiveness was not mysterious when examined closely. It was built on several interlocking advantages that the Koreans possessed, and American forces generally did not. First, motivation. Korean soldiers were not draftees fulfilling an obligation to a war many questioned. They were volunteers, selected from the best units in the Korean military, fighting an ideology that had nearly destroyed their own nation within living memory. Their hatred of communism was not abstract. It was forged in personal and national trauma. Many had lost family members in the Korean War. Some had survived North Korean occupation. When they killed Viet Cong fighters, they were fighting the same enemy, or so they understood it, that had invaded their homeland. Second, cultural advantage. Korean soldiers were Asian, operating in an Asian country. They could blend into crowds more effectively than American troops. They understood Confucian social hierarchies, Buddhist religious practices, and rice farming agricultural rhythms on an intuitive level that no amount of American cross-cultural training could replicate. They learned Vietnamese faster and used it more effectively. They approached Vietnamese villagers not as exotic foreigners, but as fellow Asians with recognizable customs and dietary habits. Third, physical conditioning. The daily taekwondo training was not merely exercise, it was combat preparation that transformed every Korean soldier into a close-quarters weapon independent of his rifle. In the tunnel complexes and jungle thickets of Vietnam, where engagements happened at distances measured in feet rather than meters, this capability provided an advantage that no amount of American firepower could substitute. Fourth, institutional memory. Korean officers and NCOs had fought their own counterinsurgency against communist guerrillas on Jeju Island, against North Korean infiltrators along the DMZ, against irregular forces during the Korean War itself. They understood insurgency not as an abstract concept studied at military schools, but as a lived reality from their own national experience. And fifth, the willingness to stay. Korean forces did not rotate in and out of areas on short-duration operations. They established permanent positions, patrolled continuously, and maintained pressure on enemy forces around the clock, around the calendar. The Viet Cong could wait out an American sweep. They could not wait out a Korean presence that simply never left. By the time Korean forces began withdrawing from Vietnam in 1971 and 1972, they had served longer than most Allied forces, remaining until the Paris Peace Accords ended foreign military involvement in 1973. Approximately 5,000 Korean soldiers died during the war. Roughly 320,000 had served. They left behind a tactical record that was, by the metrics that military professionals use to measure such things, among the most effective of any Allied force in the conflict. They also left behind a legacy of civilian suffering that Vietnamese communities remember to this day, that South Korean society has only begun to honestly confront, and that complicates any simple narrative of Korean heroism or Korean barbarism. Both existed, both were real, both were products of the same institutional culture that valued aggressive action, absolute discipline, and the willingness to do whatever the mission required without the restraints that American rules of engagement, however imperfectly enforced, attempted to impose. The economic consequences of Korean participation in Vietnam transformed South Korea itself. The billions of dollars in American payments, grants, loans, and preferential economic treatment that flowed to Seoul as compensation for Korean deployment funded the industrial development that would become the Miracle on the Han River. Korean construction companies that won military contracts in Vietnam became the conglomerates that would build modern South Korea. Korean workers who earned combat pay sent money home to families who invested it in education and small businesses. The war that devastated Vietnam provided the capital that helped build the South Korea we know today. That irony has never been fully resolved. The Korean Marines who defended Tra Binh Dong, who cleared Binh Dinh province, who held the coastal highways open, who fought with bayonets and bare hands when their ammunition ran out, were extraordinary soldiers by any measure. They were also instruments of a policy that produced both remarkable tactical success and terrible human cost. They demonstrated that a force with the right motivation, training, cultural awareness, and willingness to fight at close quarters could achieve results that technology and firepower alone could not match. They also demonstrated that an absence of restraint, when unleashed against populations intertwined with combatants, produces atrocities that echo across generations. The Viet Cong called them the ghost-catching Marines. The name carried respect, fear, and something else, an acknowledgement that these were soldiers who operated by rules that communist fighters, veterans of decades of jungle warfare, found genuinely difficult to counter. The ghosts of Vietnam had met something that hunted them back. That is the Korean legacy in Vietnam. Courage and brutality, effectiveness and excess, excellence in combat and failure in restraint, a force that terrified everyone, including, eventually, the nation that sent them. 320,000 Koreans served. 5,000 never came home. Those who did carried memories that South Korea is still learning to process, still debating how to honor, still struggling to reconcile with a national story that prefers heroes to complexity. But complexity is what Vietnam demanded from everyone who fought there. The Koreans were no exception. They fought their own war, on their own terms, answering to their own chain of command. And they left behind a record that the enemy respected, the Allies envied, the victims remembered, and history is still trying to judge. The ghost-catching Marines, the fierce Tigers, the White Horse Division, the Blue Dragons, they proved that a nation barely recovered from its own devastating war could project military force halfway across the world with effectiveness that stunned allies and enemies alike. They also proved that effectiveness without accountability produces wounds that outlast any ceasefire. Both truths matter. Both truths endure. And both truths belong to anyone willing to learn from what happened in those jungles, on those hilltops, in those villages, where 320,000 Koreans fought a war that was not their own and made it, for better and for worse, entirely theirs.